Hey everyone, today we're stepping quietly into a world that seems almost frozen in time. Life in the Middle Ages was shaped by rules that reached into nearly every corner of daily existence. From the moment a person was born, their place in society was largely defined by family, by occupation, by land, and by faith. These expectations were not simply traditions, they were enforced customs backed by law, religion, and community pressure. Clothing could be regulated by status, determining which fabrics or colors someone was allowed to wear. Meals were influenced by religious calendars that dictated when certain foods were forbidden. Travel often required permission, especially for peasants bound to the land. Even celebrations, marriages, and burial practices followed strict guidelines rooted in both local custom and church authority. Markets operated under carefully monitored systems of weights and measures. Guilds controlled who could practice a craft and how goods were produced. Curfews in many towns signaled when streets were to fall silent. In some regions, hunting in nearby forests without noble approval could lead to severe punishment. These rules may seem unusual today, yet they formed the structure of a world built on hierarchy and obligation. Understanding them offers a window into how medieval societies maintained order, protected tradition, and reinforced power. What might appear strange now once provided a sense of stability in a time when survival depended on clearly defined boundaries. In this exploration, we step into that world, where daily life unfolded within a web of expectations, and where even the smallest actions were guided by laws both written and unwritten. In the Middle Ages, life was shaped less by personal preference and more by layers of expectation that pressed gently, but persistently, upon every household, village, and town. The strange rules that governed society were not always written in large volumes or proclaimed loudly in marketplaces. Many existed quietly, woven into custom, ritual, and assumption. To live within medieval Europe meant accepting boundaries that defined clothing, movement, food, worship, work, and even laughter. The first rule was belonging. A person was not simply an individual. One was born into a structure that stretched upward toward crown and altar, and downward toward soil and livestock. Feudal bonds connected peasants to lords, lords to monarchs, and monarchs, at least in theory, to divine authority. Obligation was reciprocal, yet rarely equal. The expectation of loyalty governed conduct from cradle to grave. In many regions, the manor formed the heart of daily existence. The open field system divided arable land into long, narrow strips allocated among villagers. A peasant could not cultivate freely wherever soil seemed fertile. Plots were assigned and rotated under communal agreement, supervised by the lord's steward. The pattern ensured cooperation, but it also restricted choice. Serfdom introduced further limitation. Bound laborers were tied legally to the land they tilled. They owed days of unpaid service, known as corvée, during which they worked the lord's domain fields rather than their own. Departure without permission constituted a breach of law. Even marriage sometimes required approval, particularly if it risked transferring labor obligations beyond the manor's reach. In towns, rules took on different forms. Guilds regulated craft and commerce with meticulous care. A weaver in a city such as Florence could not simply set up a loom and begin trading. Apprenticeship lasted years, overseen by masters who controlled standards of quality and price. To produce cloth outside guild oversight invited fines or confiscation. Regulation preserved reputation, yet it constrained innovation. Clothing, too, was subject to regulation. Sumptuary laws dictated who might wear silk, velvet, or certain dyes. In kingdoms like England, statutes specified which fabrics were appropriate for each rank. Purple and scarlet often signified high status, fur linings were restricted to nobility. A merchant's wife could not adorn herself as a countess without risking penalty. Garment and hierarchy were intertwined. Food bore similar distinctions. Hunting rights were jealously guarded. Forests designated as royal preserves allowed only sanctioned nobles to pursue deer or boar. Poaching, even to relieve hunger, could bring harsh punishment. Bread quality was also regulated. The assize of bread set standards for weight and price, adjusted according to grain costs. Bakers were inspected, dishonest measures resulted in public humiliation. The church extended its authority across daily life. Attendance at Mass was not merely devotional, it was expected. The liturgical calendar structured time itself. Feast days interrupted labor, while fasting seasons limited diet. During Lent, consumption of meat was forbidden for most, encouraging reliance on fish, legumes, and stored grains. Compliance was both spiritual discipline and communal norm. Marriage fell under ecclesiastical jurisdiction. The sacrament required mutual consent, yet it also demanded adherence to rules regarding kinship. Canon law prohibited unions within certain degrees of relation, calculated through complex genealogical reckoning. Couples discovered after the fact to be too closely related could face annulment. Speech was not entirely free. Heresy laws sought to protect doctrinal unity. In regions influenced by inquisitorial courts, deviation from accepted belief carried grave consequences. Though such tribunals were not constant in every place, their presence reinforced the expectation of orthodoxy. In universities emerging during the 12th and 13th centuries, intellectual life followed codified patterns. Institutions like Paris became centers of theological debate, yet students adhered to structured curricula. Lectures were delivered in Latin. Disputation followed prescribed forms. Academic robes signaled discipline and rank. Even within monasteries, rules multiplied. The rule of Saint Benedict outlined daily conduct in detail: hours of prayer, silence during meals, obedience to superiors. Monks relinquished personal property, sharing all goods communally. The schedule governed sleep and waking, labor and contemplation. Freedom was redefined as submission to order. Urban centers introduced curfews. City gates closed at dusk. Night travel required permission or legitimate purpose. Watchmen patrolled streets, carrying lanterns and staffs. Fire regulations prohibited certain activities after dark to reduce risk in tightly packed neighborhoods of timber and thatch. Markets operated under supervision. Officials inspected weights and measures to ensure fairness. Foreign merchants often required sponsorship from local authorities. Trading outside designated days or locations could provoke sanction. Women's lives were circumscribed by custom. Inheritance practices varied by region, yet in many areas property passed primarily through male lines. Widows sometimes retained management rights, but remarriage could alter holdings significantly. Female participation in guilds occurred, though often in limited capacity or through association with husbands. Travel involved formalities. Pilgrims journeying to shrines such as Canterbury Cathedral often carried letters of introduction. Safe conduct documents protected merchants crossing territorial boundaries. Roads were not merely physical paths but corridors shaped by legal frameworks. Punishment served both corrective and symbolic purposes. Stocks and pillories displayed offenders publicly. Banishment removed individuals from communal protection. Monetary fines adjusted according to status reflected stratified justice. Land tenure demanded documentation. Charters recorded grants and obligations. Seals affixed to parchment authenticated claims. Disputes over boundary stones or grazing rights could persist for generations. Music and celebration were not exempt from oversight. During certain penitential periods, dancing and elaborate festivities were discouraged. Carnival, by contrast, provided temporary inversion of norms, though even this release followed calendrical structure. Hygiene practices were shaped by prevailing medical understanding. Public bathhouses existed in many cities, yet moral concerns sometimes led authorities to regulate their operation. Beliefs about humoral balance influenced dietary and seasonal habits. Taxation intersected with faith. The tithe required a tenth of agricultural produce for church support. Secular levies funded military campaigns and infrastructure. Collection was systematic, often recorded in detailed rolls. In rural villages, communal ovens baked bread collectively, reinforcing interdependence. Millers controlled access to grinding facilities, collecting fees in grain. Attempting to bypass the Lord's mill constituted infringement. Even leisure carried expectation. Archery practice was mandated in certain kingdoms to maintain readiness for war. In England, statutes encouraged proficiency with the longbow, shaping Sunday recreation into preparation for conflict. Timekeeping, though imprecise by modern standards, remained regulated by church bells and market hours. Seasonal labor followed agricultural necessity, yet saints' days punctuated the year with ritual repetition. These rules were not uniformly oppressive, nor uniformly benevolent. They created predictability within uncertainty. They defined identity within community. Yet they also narrowed possibility, binding individuals to inherited roles. To understand the Middle Ages is to recognize how deeply order permeated life. Not chaos, but constraint-shaped experience. Within stone walls and open fields, beneath cathedral vaults and thatched roofs, a network of expectations governed movement, dress, belief, and aspiration. And beyond these visible structures lay further peculiarities, rules concerning disease, purity, animals, time, and even color, that would shape medieval existence in ways both subtle and startling. The landscape of regulation extended far beyond what might first appear. Beyond land, clothing, and occupation, medieval life imposed expectations directly upon the human body itself. Flesh was not considered wholly private. It belonged partly to God, partly to family, and partly to community. How one ate, slept, married, labored, healed, and even walked through public space was measured against moral and social codes that shaped conduct from infancy onward. From the moment of birth, ritual framed existence. Baptism occurred swiftly, often within days, sometimes within hours if survival seemed uncertain. The belief that unbaptized infants could not enter the fullness of heaven created urgency. Midwives were trained not only in practical care but in emergency sacramental procedure. Water and formulaic words carried spiritual weight equal to medical attention. Naming followed tradition rather than whim. Children were frequently given the names of saints whose feast days coincided with birth or whose virtues parents hoped to invoke. Identity thus tied itself immediately to the liturgical calendar and to exemplars drawn from sacred history. As children grew, discipline became communal. Apprenticeship contracts bound young adolescents to masters for terms that could extend 7 years or more. The body learned through repetition, hammer striking anvil, needle passing through cloth, chisel carving stone. Posture, endurance, and restraint were cultivated deliberately. Corporal punishment was not unusual in educational contexts. Belief in the moral utility of correction supported physical reprimand. Medieval pedagogy assumed that discipline shaped virtue. Pain, administered sparingly or sternly depending on temperament, was viewed as formative rather than destructive. Food intake reflected not only availability but obligation. Fasting seasons were extensive. In addition to Lent, vigils before major feasts required abstinence from meat. Fridays often excluded flesh entirely. Such dietary rhythms structured metabolism around sacred chronology. Feasts, when permitted, were celebrated richly yet remained bound to occasion. Gluttony ranked among the 7 deadly sins. Overindulgence threatened both soul and reputation. Moral treatises warned against excessive drinking, particularly in taverns where disorder might erupt. Ale and wine were common, yet moderation remained idealized. Sleep followed communal expectations. In monasteries, nocturnal offices required waking during dark hours for prayer. In households, extended families shared limited space. Privacy was rare, modesty codes compensated for proximity. Medical understanding rested upon humoral theory inherited from antiquity. Health depended upon balance among blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Physicians prescribed diet, bloodletting, herbal infusions, and changes in environment to restore equilibrium. Illness signified imbalance rather than isolated pathology. Hospitals existed, though not as modern institutions. Many were attached to religious foundations, offering shelter and basic care to the poor and infirm. In cities like Florence, charitable confraternities supported such establishments. Treatment focused on comfort, cleanliness, and prayer as much as cure. Plague altered bodily perception dramatically. The arrival of the Black Death in the 14th century reshaped regulation and fear. Quarantine measures emerged in ports such as Venice, where ships arriving from infected regions were required to wait offshore for designated periods. Isolation became a protective strategy. Urban sanitation laws gained urgency. Authorities mandated removal of waste from streets. Tanners and butchers were sometimes relocated to peripheral districts due to odor and contamination concerns. Wells were inspected. Water sources guarded carefully. Clothing regulations extended into matters of modesty. Necklines, sleeve lengths, and headdresses were subject to scrutiny. Excessively pointed shoes or elaborate hairstyles might provoke censure. Bodily display implied moral laxity in conservative communities. Marriage consummation carried theological significance. Though mutual consent formed the essence of the sacrament, physical union completed it. Ecclesiastical courts sometimes examined claims of impotence or non-consummation, intruding into intimate matters with clinical detachment. Chastity was idealized for clergy and monastics. Celibacy distinguished religious vocation from secular life. Violations undermined institutional credibility and could result in removal from office. Manuals detailed conduct appropriate for maintaining purity. Pilgrimage imposed physical trial. Journeys to shrines such as Santiago de Compostela required endurance across rugged terrain. Blisters, hunger, and fatigue were embraced as penitential offering. Pilgrim badges worn upon return testified to bodily perseverance. Public penance sometimes required visible expression. Those guilty of certain offenses might process barefoot through streets, wearing simple garments as signs of contrition. The body became symbol of repentance. Legal codes addressed bodily harm with graduated precision. Compensation for injury often depended upon severity and social rank. In some law codes, detailed tariffs assigned value to fingers, teeth, or limbs. Justice quantified the body. Execution methods varied by crime and class. Nobles might receive comparatively swift deaths, while common criminals faced more prolonged spectacles. Punishment communicated authority and deterrence through corporeal display. Hair itself carried meaning. Monks adopted tonsure, shaving crowns to signify humility and separation from worldly fashion. Married women covered hair with veils or wimples as markers of modesty. Personal adornment reflected hierarchy. Jewelry signified status, yet overuse invited suspicion of vanity. Guild statutes occasionally limited decorative excess among members. Body odor was understood differently than in later centuries. Bathing frequency varied, influenced by climate, availability of facilities, and medical belief. Perfumed oils masked scent when necessary. Public bathhouses in cities such as Paris offered cleansing spaces before moral reform movements reduced their number. Pregnancy and childbirth involved ritual caution. Women relied upon midwives skilled in herbal remedies and practical technique. Prayers to particular saints accompanied labor. Infant survival remained uncertain, intensifying communal support. Diet during illness shifted according to humoral prescription. Certain meats were deemed heating, others cooling. Spices imported through trade routes were valued not merely for flavor but for perceived medicinal benefit. Travelers carried letters of safe conduct to protect bodily security along highways. Banditry persisted in remote areas. Armed escorts sometimes accompanied merchant caravans. Physical labor defined peasant existence. Plowing, harvesting, spinning, and hauling shaped musculature and endurance. Rest was limited during peak agricultural seasons. Feast days provided necessary respite. In contrast, aristocratic bodies were trained for mounted combat. Knights practiced horsemanship and weapons handling from youth. Tournaments tested skill within controlled spectacle. Illiteracy among the majority meant knowledge transmitted through memory and demonstration. The body remembered what parchment did not record. Even posture within church reflected hierarchy. Seating arrangements distinguished rank. Kneeling signified humility, standing marked attention. Music engaged the body collectively. Processions during feast days involved coordinated movement through streets. Dance, though occasionally restricted, formed part of communal celebration when permitted. Seasonal disease influenced regulation of markets. During outbreaks, authorities restricted large gatherings. Bells sometimes tolled to signal curfew during contagion. Medical licensing emerged gradually in university towns. Institutions such as those in Bologna formalized training for physicians, distinguishing learned practitioners from folk healers. Executioners occupied ambiguous social status. Their work was necessary yet stigmatized. Some lived on town margins, both physically and socially. In agricultural villages, shared wells required cooperation. Contamination could affect all households. Regulations governed maintenance and usage. Mourning practices dictated bodily presentation. Black garments signified bereavement in some regions. Periods of formal grief restricted participation in festivities. Even laughter and gesture fell under scrutiny. Excessive display in sacred spaces was discouraged. Sermons warned against immoderate mirth. Through all these layers of regulation, the medieval body existed within a web of expectation. It knelt, fasted, labored, healed, married, and mourned according to rhythms prescribed by faith, law, and tradition. The strange rules were not merely external constraints, they shaped muscle memory, appetite, posture, and breath. And yet beyond the governance of flesh lay further intricacies, codes that extended into nature itself, regulating animals, forests, rivers, and unseen forces believed to inhabit the world. The order of the Middle Ages reached into soil and sky alike. Beyond the fields and market squares, regulation extended into the most intimate dimensions of existence. The human body itself stood at the intersection of doctrine, medicine, and superstition. To inhabit flesh during the Middle Ages was to dwell within a framework of expectations that reached from cradle rituals to burial rites, from dietary caution to prescribed penance. Birth unfolded within a matrix of custom. Midwives carried both practical knowledge and spiritual responsibility. In many regions, they were instructed to baptize an infant immediately if death seemed imminent, ensuring salvation before the child drew a final breath. Manuals circulated advising them on emergency rites, revealing how theology penetrated even the first moments of life. The presence of relics in birthing chambers was not uncommon, as families sought protection through proximity to sanctity. Infancy brought further regulation. Wet nurses were often subject to scrutiny, particularly among urban elites. Contracts specified duration of service, conduct, and even dietary habits believed to influence the quality of milk. Municipal statutes occasionally required registration of such caregivers to prevent neglect or deception. The bond between nourishment and morality seemed inseparable. Childhood advanced under communal watchfulness. In agrarian communities, young people contributed to household labor early, yet certain behaviors were sharply constrained. Games perceived as gambling risked reprimand. In towns, apprentices lived within the homes of masters, absorbing craft discipline alongside codes of obedience. Fines awaited those who wandered after curfew or neglected religious observance. Education, where available, adhered to formal boundaries. Cathedral schools prepared boys for clerical careers through rigorous instruction in grammar, rhetoric, and logic. Latin functioned as the language of scholarship, binding disparate regions into intellectual continuity. Scriptoria required precision, scribes followed established abbreviations and decorative conventions, reinforcing continuity across manuscripts. Errors carried consequences, both reputational and financial. Manuscript production embodied discipline in material form. Parchment preparation, ink mixing, and rubrication demanded adherence to inherited technique. Marginal illustrations might include playful creatures, yet their placement and symbolism often aligned with theological themes. The page itself became a regulated landscape of proportion and hierarchy. Illness introduced another domain of rule. Medical theory, influenced by ancient authorities such as Galen, interpreted disease through imbalance of humors. Bloodletting followed calendrical charts aligning treatment with astrological positions. Physicians consulted almanacs before selecting remedies, believing planetary alignment affected bodily fluids. Hospitals, frequently attached to monasteries, imposed structured routines of prayer and care. The sick were not merely patients but participants in spiritual discipline. Leprosaria on the outskirts of towns illustrated social boundary. Those diagnosed with leprosy underwent rituals resembling funerals, symbolizing separation from communal life. Regulations governed their clothing, often requiring distinctive garments or bells to signal approach. Charity supported them, yet proximity remained restricted. The management of contagion intertwined compassion with exclusion. Death, when it arrived, unfolded within codified ceremony. Burial grounds were consecrated spaces, and placement within them reflected status. Wealthier individuals secured chapels or elaborate tombs, while the poor rested in common earth. Guilds maintained burial funds for members, ensuring proper rites. Anniversary masses commemorated souls, reinforcing the notion that memory required maintenance. Within domestic interiors, architecture mirrored hierarchy. In manor houses, the Great Hall functioned as communal center, yet private chambers emerged gradually, offering limited seclusion. Seating arrangements followed rank, placement at table conveyed authority. Even the direction of entry signaled deference. Urban residences incorporated narrow facades and shared walls, prompting fire regulations and inspection. Chimneys, a later innovation, transformed ventilation yet required oversight to prevent sparks from igniting timber beams. Ordinances addressed waste disposal, mandating specific hours for emptying chamber pots into streets or designated pits. Sanitation operated within negotiated tolerance rather than modern hygiene. Water sources received particular attention. Wells were protected by covers, and contamination could bring fines. In port cities, access to docks followed schedules determined by tide and commerce. Harbor masters monitored unloading of goods, collecting tariffs while enforcing quarantine during outbreaks of disease. Maritime life possessed its own codes. Sailors swore oaths before voyages, binding themselves to mutual obligation. Maritime law addressed salvage rights, mutiny, and distribution of profit. Ports such as Venice cultivated elaborate statutes regulating trade routes across the Mediterranean, ensuring consistency in contracts and insurance agreements. On the Iberian Peninsula, frontier societies developed distinctive norms shaped by prolonged conflict and coexistence. In regions reclaimed during the Reconquista, charters granted settlers privileges in exchange for military readiness. Towns like Toledo contained Christian, Muslim, and Jewish quarters, each governed by internal rules yet subject to overarching authority. Dress distinctions sometimes marked religious identity, reflecting both coexistence and division. Across the Pyrenees, pilgrimage routes fostered transient communities. The road to Santiago drew travelers from distant lands, prompting establishment of hostels regulated by ecclesiastical oversight. Pilgrim badges identified journeyers and conferred certain protections. Theft against them carried severe penalty, underscoring the sanctity attributed to travel for devotion. In northern climates, seasonal variation imposed additional constraints. Scandinavian assemblies known as things convened to settle disputes and enact laws. Attendance was obligatory for free men, embedding governance within landscape. Longhouses accommodated extended families, reinforcing collective responsibility during harsh winters. The legal sphere expanded through written codification. In the 13th century, royal courts in France increasingly recorded proceedings, shaping precedent. Appeals required formal petitions sealed and witnessed. Trial by ordeal gradually diminished under ecclesiastical criticism, replaced by testimonial evidence and jury deliberation in some realms. Monetary systems demanded regulation as coinage circulated more widely. Mints operated under sovereign authority, and debasement of currency could destabilize trust. Inspectors examined weight and metal purity. Counterfeiting incurred severe sanction, as it threatened not merely commerce but political legitimacy. Agricultural practice involved cyclical obligation beyond field rotation. Common pastures required collective agreement regarding herd size and grazing period. Disputes over boundaries were adjudicated through perambulation ceremonies, during which villagers walked limits annually to reaffirm memory. Children sometimes participated, imprinting geography upon recollection. Forestry management carried both economic and symbolic weight. Timber for shipbuilding and cathedral construction required careful oversight. Unauthorized felling risked reprisal. Royal forests, distinct from ordinary woodland, fell under specialized courts. The preservation of game intertwined with assertion of authority. Cathedral building projects revealed regulation at monumental scale. Master masons supervised teams through carefully organized lodges. Measurements adhered to geometric principles believed to reflect divine order. Funding derived from donations, indulgences, and municipal contributions, all recorded in meticulous accounts. Construction spanned decades, binding generations to shared vision. Liturgical music followed structured notation. Gregorian chant employed neumes indicating melodic contour. Choirs practiced according to canonical hours, reinforcing temporal rhythm. Variations required ecclesiastical approval, preserving unity across distant dioceses. Artisanship beyond guild walls existed but risked censure. Rural craftsmen produced tools and textiles outside formal oversight, yet their goods seldom reached urban markets. Traveling tinkers repaired utensils, navigating boundaries between necessity and suspicion. Festivals punctuated the year with controlled exuberance. Processions carried relics through streets, affirming communal identity. Municipal councils authorized expenditures for decorations and pageantry. Yet excess could prompt restriction, particularly if violence or disorder threatened. Judicial punishment evolved in public view. Corporal penalties, though harsh, conveyed warning through spectacle. However, mercy sometimes intervened, especially during major feast days. Royal pardons announced on such occasions reinforced sovereign benevolence. Diplomatic exchange required ritual precision. Envoys presented credentials bearing seals and ribbons signifying authenticity. Gift-giving followed protocol, reflecting hierarchy among courts. Failure to observe etiquette risked insult. Intellectual currents shifted gradually, yet remained bounded by orthodoxy. The scholastic method sought reconciliation between faith and reason, operating within permitted texts. Commentaries on Aristotle circulated widely, though their interpretation was carefully scrutinized. Weather and natural disaster were interpreted through spiritual lens. Drought prompted communal prayer, floods invited penitential procession. Municipal authorities sometimes organized collective fasting to seek relief, blending governance with devotion. Military organization displayed layered obligation. Knights owed service for specified days annually, while mercenaries contracted for coin. Armor regulations prescribed equipment standards. Musters recorded attendance, ensuring readiness against threat. Within castles, storage rooms cataloged provisions meticulously. Salted meat, dried legumes, and grain reserves sustained garrisons through siege. Inventories updated regularly reflected concern for accountability. Frontier regions fostered experimentation. In eastern territories settled by German-speaking migrants, new towns adopted Magdeburg law, granting degrees of self-governance. Urban councils elected from among burghers exercised jurisdiction distinct from feudal overlords, illustrating adaptability within constraint. Spiritual movements occasionally challenged established patterns. Mendicant orders embraced itinerancy, renouncing property while preaching in marketplaces. Their poverty contrasted with monastic stability, yet papal approval framed their activity within orthodoxy. Libraries guarded access to knowledge. Chains secured valuable volumes to desks, preventing removal. Catalogues listed holdings by subject and author, revealing an emerging consciousness of intellectual inventory. As centuries progressed, plague altered patterns of regulation. Quarantine measures emerged in port cities, requiring ships to anchor offshore for designated periods. Lazarettos housed the infected under supervision. Fear reshaped civic policy, introducing unprecedented intervention into mobility. Rural depopulation shifted labor relations. Survivors negotiated wages with greater leverage, prompting authorities to issue statutes attempting to freeze compensation at pre-plague levels. Enforcement proved uneven, illustrating tension between decree and lived reality. Across the Mediterranean, commercial republics developed maritime insurance contracts distributing risk among investors. Written agreements detailed cargo, route, and hazard. Such instruments formalized uncertainty, embedding foresight within trade. In marketplaces, measurement tools were displayed publicly to reinforce trust. Standardized elwans determined cloth length. Grain measures bore official stamps. Inspection days reaffirmed communal standards. The passage of time itself underwent refinement. Mechanical clocks installed in civic towers marked hours audibly, supplementing ecclesiastical bells. Regular chimes structured labor and commerce more precisely, introducing new sensitivity to duration. Landscape boundaries were inscribed not only in parchment but in stone crosses and carved markers. Travelers recognized territorial shifts through heraldic symbols displayed on gates and bridges. Throughout these varied domains, regulation did not extinguish individuality entirely. Creativity persisted within margins, devotion coexisted with pragmatism, and adaptation unfolded gradually. Yet the overarching pattern remained unmistakable. Medieval existence was shaped by interlocking frameworks that reached from the vastness of royal authority to the quiet arrangement of a household hearth. The body moved through corridors defined by belief, obligation, and inherited memory. Seasons advanced, rulers changed, cities expanded, but the pervasive presence of rule, sometimes protective, sometimes restrictive, continued to shape experience. Within that intricate web, medieval society sustained continuity across centuries, balancing stability and transformation beneath the steady rhythm of bells and banners. Beyond the rhythms of bells and banners lay spheres of authority less visible yet equally consequential. Influence radiated not only from throne and altar but also from parchment rooms, counting tables, border fortresses, and quiet rural chapels where decisions shaped destinies without spectacle. Governance in the later medieval centuries became increasingly layered, creating networks that extended across mountains, rivers, and seas. Royal households functioned as itinerant courts in many realms. Monarchs did not always reside in a single capital but traveled between estates, drawing administration with them. Wherever the court settled, local economies shifted. Bakers, brewers, scribes, and armorers responded to temporary demand. The presence of sovereign authority required elaborate provisioning, regulated by clerks who recorded expenditure with disciplined precision. In the Iberian kingdoms, rulers such as Isabella I of Castile presided over councils that refined bureaucratic procedure. Written petitions multiplied, sealed responses circulated, and archives expanded as statecraft grew increasingly document-based. Authority became something not merely proclaimed but filed, indexed, and retrieved. Across the Channel, the English Parliament evolved gradually from feudal assembly into consultative body with defined privileges. Summonses issued to shires and boroughs specified representation. Proceedings recorded grievances alongside taxation grants. Political participation remained limited, yet the notion of consent to levy emerged within formal structure. In the Holy Roman Empire, decentralization fostered diversity. Imperial diets convened princes, bishops, and free cities to negotiate policy. Within this framework, towns like Nuremberg cultivated semi-autonomous governance, maintaining their own militias and commercial treaties. Civic identity intertwined with allegiance to a distant emperor. Frontiers continued to test resilience. Along the eastern boundaries of Christendom, military orders such as the Teutonic Knights established fortified settlements. Castles rose amid forests and marshlands, serving as administrative centers as much as defensive strongholds. Colonists received land grants under specific tenure conditions, binding expansion to rule. In the eastern Mediterranean, the aftermath of crusading ventures produced hybrid polities. The Kingdom of Cyprus blended Frankish feudal customs with Byzantine influence. Legal codes adapted to multilingual populations, reflecting pragmatic accommodation within overarching hierarchy. Trade networks extended toward the Baltic through the Hanseatic League, an alliance of merchant towns cooperating to protect commercial interests. Warehouses stored wax, furs, timber, and grain destined for distant markets. Agreements among cities regulated tariffs and mutual defense. Merchants traveling between Lübeck and Bruges relied upon shared legal frameworks that transcended territorial boundaries. Agricultural innovation quietly reshaped rural life. The heavy plow, suited to northern soils, enabled deeper cultivation. Horse collars improved traction without harming animals. Such technological adjustments required collective adaptation. Communal fields could not alter method without consensus. Regulation therefore mediated progress. Vineyards in regions such as Burgundy followed meticulous seasonal cycles. Monastic communities oversaw cultivation, documenting weather patterns and harvest yields. Wine production adhered to standards ensuring consistency for liturgical use and commerce alike. Storage in oak barrels demanded care to prevent spoilage, reinforcing attentiveness to craft. Climatic fluctuation introduced instability. The onset of cooler temperatures during the later Middle Ages shortened growing seasons in parts of Europe. Crop failures prompted municipal authorities to impose price controls on grain. Importation of food from less affected regions required negotiation and convoy protection. Environmental stress tested regulatory capacity. In mining districts, subterranean labor unfolded under specialized codes. Silver extraction in Saxony attracted skilled workers who operated within contractual agreements detailing shares of output. Safety concerns, though limited by contemporary knowledge, prompted rudimentary oversight. Revenues from mining enriched princely treasuries, binding natural resources to political leverage. River systems functioned as arteries of commerce. Toll stations along the Rhine collected fees from passing vessels. Disputes over rate or exemption could escalate into conflict between neighboring lords. Regulation of waterways demanded coordination, revealing tension between local control and broader economic flow. Craftsmanship evolved beyond guild tradition in certain contexts. Court artists commissioned for illuminated manuscripts or tapestries worked under patronage that allowed stylistic experimentation within thematic constraint. Workshops in Bruges developed reputations for fine textiles exported widely. Quality marks embedded in fabric assured buyers of authenticity. Religious devotion manifested in confraternities that organized charity, processions, and communal prayer. Membership required adherence to statutes governing attendance and contribution. Such lay associations offered spiritual engagement outside monastic enclosure while remaining subject to episcopal supervision. Across the Alps, pastoral communities practiced transhumance, moving flocks seasonally between valleys and high meadows. Rights to mountain pastures were codified through local agreement. Pathways, though ancient, were legally recognized corridors shaped by negotiation. Intellectual curiosity widened horizons. Contact with Islamic scholarship through translation centers in places like Granada transmitted mathematical and medical knowledge into Latin Christendom. Universities incorporated these texts cautiously, filtering them through theological interpretation. Cross-cultural exchange operated within guarded boundaries. Cartography advanced gradually. Portal and charts depicted coastlines with surprising accuracy, guiding mariners across Mediterranean waters. Mapmakers balanced empirical observation with symbolic representation, including monsters or saints at margins. Navigation remained constrained by season and wind, yet imagination expanded geographic perception. Courtly culture cultivated codes of conduct distinct from rural existence. Chivalric manuals instructed knights in etiquette, heraldry, and martial virtue. Tournaments adhered to prescribed rules governing weaponry and conduct. Though sometimes violent, these events were structured performances reinforcing aristocratic identity. In monasteries, scriptural exegesis continued to refine theological discourse. Marginal glosses accumulated over generations, layering interpretation upon interpretation. Silence during certain hours underscored contemplative discipline, yet intellectual labor thrived within cloister walls. Jewish communities across Europe maintained internal governance through councils that adjudicated disputes according to rabbinic law. While subject to Christian rulers, they navigated dual legal systems with resilience. Restrictions on occupation often channeled activity toward trade or finance, fostering complex economic interdependence. In some regions, legal pluralism characterized daily reality. A merchant operating in the Crown of Aragon might encounter Roman law principles, local customary codes, and royal edicts simultaneously. Mastery of such complexity required professional jurists whose expertise commanded respect. Textile production in rural cottages supplemented agrarian income. Women spun wool during winter months, contributing to broader commercial circuits. Though often invisible in formal records, their labor underpinned export economies. Armament manufacturing demanded standardized measurement. Blacksmiths crafted mail and plate according to specified dimensions. Storage of gunpowder, increasingly present by the late Middle Ages, required caution. Municipal statutes addressed safekeeping to prevent accidental explosion within crowded quarters. Pilgrimage extended beyond local shrines toward distant destinations such as Jerusalem. Those undertaking such journeys arranged property management in advance, sometimes drafting wills before departure. Travel licenses from authorities reduced risk of suspicion abroad. Ritual fasting and feast shaped dietary cycles beyond ecclesiastical calendar. Regional saints' days added local variation. Markets adjusted supply accordingly, anticipating increased demand for particular foods. Public works projects illustrated cooperative governance. Bridges spanning major rivers required collective funding. Tolls levied upon crossing repaid investment while financing maintenance. Failure to repair such infrastructure could isolate communities economically. The visual language of heraldry structured perception of lineage. Coats of arms displayed on shields, banners, and seals conveyed ancestry and alliance. Heralds maintained records to prevent duplication, preserving symbolic order. Literary production broadened vernacular expression. Poets composed epics and romances in languages accessible beyond clerical elite. Manuscript circulation depended upon patronage, yet themes increasingly reflected lay experience. In agricultural hinterlands, customary courts resolved minor disputes over livestock trespass or boundary encroachment. Decisions recorded in manorial rolls provided continuity across generations. Attendance reinforced communal obligation. Epidemics beyond plague occasionally afflicted livestock, threatening subsistence. Authorities imposed movement restrictions on herds to limit spread. Veterinary knowledge remained rudimentary, yet regulation sought to mitigate loss. Markets specializing in specific commodities emerged. Champagne fairs facilitated long-distance trade between northern and southern Europe. Schedules determined safe conduct for merchants, and specialized courts resolved commercial disagreements swiftly to preserve confidence. Rural parish churches served not only spiritual function but also communal meeting space. Announcements concerning taxation, defense, or festival planning were disseminated following services, intertwining sacred and secular spheres. Technological experimentation appeared in windmill design and water-powered machinery. Mill rights, however, remained carefully controlled. Unauthorized construction could infringe upon existing privilege, prompting legal contest. Music beyond liturgy flourished in courts and towns. Minstrels traveled between regions, though municipal authorities sometimes required licensing to perform publicly. Artistic expression coexisted with suspicion toward itinerancy. Legal reforms in some territories codified rights of inheritance for daughters in absence of male heirs. Such provisions altered property distribution subtly over time, demonstrating incremental adaptation within tradition. Urban fortifications required maintenance against evolving siege technology. Cannon placements transformed defensive architecture, prompting thicker walls and angled bastions. Funding for such modifications often derived from special levies. Monastic reform movements periodically sought stricter observance, critiquing perceived laxity. Chapters convened to evaluate compliance, issuing directives to restore discipline. Throughout these varied developments, perception of authority evolved. Written record assumed growing importance, shaping memory and legitimacy. Governance extended into increasingly detailed realms, yet practical enforcement remained contingent upon local cooperation. Across landscapes of vineyard, harbor, forest, and stone tower, medieval society continued to negotiate equilibrium between inherited custom and emerging necessity. Regulation persisted not as static imposition but as adaptive framework responding to environment, commerce, belief, and ambition. Within that intricate architecture of expectation, individuals navigated pathways defined by lineage, occupation, and faith, inhabiting a world at once bounded and dynamic. Toward the closing centuries of the medieval era, structures that had long appeared immovable began to shift in subtle yet undeniable ways. Regulation did not vanish, nor did hierarchy dissolve, but the texture of authority altered as new forces pressed upon inherited arrangements. Expansion, curiosity, and consolidation reshaped landscapes both literal and conceptual. Along the Atlantic seaboard, maritime ambition intensified. Shipyards in ports such as Lisbon constructed caravels capable of navigating unpredictable currents. These vessels combined lateen and square sails, enabling greater maneuverability than earlier designs. Royal sponsorship formalized exploration, with charters outlining rights to lands discovered and resources claimed. Navigators operated under explicit contracts defining profit shares and obligations to the crown. Maritime law expanded accordingly. Admiralty courts adjudicated disputes concerning captured cargo, salvage, and jurisdiction on open water. Written logs recorded daily coordinates, wind direction, and sightings, reinforcing accountability. Insurance mechanisms matured, distributing risk across investors who might never leave shore. Printing technology introduced another profound adjustment. Workshops in Mainz experimented with movable type, transforming the production of texts. Regulation quickly followed innovation. Authorities granted privileges to printers, limiting unauthorized duplication while protecting investment. The multiplication of books accelerated dissemination of devotional manuals, legal treatises, and vernacular literature, subtly broadening intellectual access. Urban growth intensified demands upon infrastructure. Aqueduct repairs and expanded drainage systems addressed swelling populations. Building codes became more explicit, prescribing materials less prone to combustion. Civic councils supervised construction projects, issuing permits and collecting fees. Stone increasingly replaced timber in central districts, altering skyline and reducing fire hazard. Financial practice grew more sophisticated. Banking families in cities such as Florence developed credit instruments facilitating long-distance trade. Bills of exchange allowed merchants to settle accounts without transporting coin across perilous routes. Regulatory oversight attempted to curb usury while accommodating practical necessity. Double-entry bookkeeping provided clarity to complex transactions, reinforcing transparency within mercantile networks. Courtly ceremony evolved in tandem with expanding bureaucracy. Royal entries into cities followed choreographed sequences involving pageants and symbolic gestures. Municipal authorities prepared streets with tapestries and triumphal arches, acknowledging sovereignty while asserting civic pride. Protocol manuals codified precedents among nobles, reducing ambiguity during formal gatherings. In agricultural regions, enclosure practices began to alter communal patterns. Landowners consolidated scattered strips into contiguous holdings, sometimes restricting customary access to common pasture. Written agreements documented transformation, though resistance occasionally emerged among displaced villagers. The negotiation between efficiency and tradition revealed tensions within rural society. Scientific curiosity, influenced by revived classical texts, encouraged closer observation of nature. Herbal compendia catalogued plants with increasing detail, integrating folk knowledge with scholastic method. Botanical gardens attached to universities cultivated specimens for study, reflecting a more empirical orientation within established frameworks. Legal codification continued to mature. In the Iberian realms, compilations such as the Siete Partidas synthesized Roman law with local custom, creating comprehensive reference for judges. Such texts did not eliminate regional variants but provided overarching coherence. Maritime republics expanded diplomatic presence abroad. Ambassadors resided in foreign courts for extended periods, maintaining correspondence through encrypted letters. Cipher systems developed to protect sensitive information, illustrating refinement in administrative practice. The Ottoman expansion into southeastern Europe introduced new political dynamics. Frontier fortresses in Hungary and the Balkans adapted to shifting threat. Tax systems in contested territories incorporated elements from both Christian and Islamic governance, producing layered identities among inhabitants. In artistic spheres, perspective techniques altered visual representation. Workshops in Florence and beyond experimented with linear perspective, reshaping spatial depiction. Patrons commissioned works that combined devotional themes with humanistic interest, reflecting gradual transition in worldview while remaining anchored in religious context. Education broadened beyond clerical elite. Grammar schools supported by municipal funds prepared sons of merchants for administrative roles. Curricula included arithmetic and practical correspondence, aligning learning with commercial life. Maritime exploration reached farther south along the African coast. Trading posts established under chartered authority regulated exchange of gold, ivory, and other commodities. Encounters with unfamiliar cultures prompted documentation through travel narratives, which in turn influenced European perceptions of geography and diversity. In Central Europe, mining technology advanced through improved drainage and ventilation systems. Investment syndicates financed deeper excavation, anticipating greater yield. Written contracts specified liability for accidents and distribution of ore. Military organization transformed with increasing use of gunpowder artillery. Siege warfare adapted accordingly, prompting redesign of fortifications into angled bastions capable of deflecting cannon fire. Ordinances regulated storage and transport of explosive materials within city walls. Ecclesiastical administration confronted internal reform movements advocating spiritual renewal. Councils convened to address corruption and clarify doctrine. Printed pamphlets circulated theological argument more rapidly than manuscript ever allowed, intensifying debate within controlled boundaries. Rural markets diversified offerings as long-distance trade introduced spices and textiles previously rare. Consumption patterns shifted gradually among urban elites, reflecting exposure to global exchange. Municipal authorities monitored weights and prices to prevent speculation. Judicial procedure incorporated more systematic evidence collection. Written depositions preserved testimony for review. Appeals mechanisms became increasingly structured, allowing litigants recourse beyond local jurisdiction. In maritime cities, cartographers compiled portolan charts integrating new discoveries. Coastal outlines extended further westward, reflecting voyages across the Atlantic. Regulatory frameworks for colonial administration began tentatively, granting governors authority defined by royal ordinance. Intellectual exchange intensified between Italy and Northern Europe. Scholars traveled between universities, carrying manuscripts and ideas. Patronage networks supported translation projects, widening intellectual horizon while maintaining theological oversight. Guild structures adapted to new economic realities. Some crafts merged or reorganized to remain competitive amid changing demand. Statutes revised apprenticeship length and quality standards, illustrating flexibility within tradition. Public health initiatives gained prominence following recurring outbreaks of disease. Permanent health boards established quarantine protocols and monitored foreign arrivals. Bills of health issued to ships attested to absence of contagion, blending commerce with medical precaution. In regions such as Seville, trade with the Americas soon altered economic balance. Warehouses stored silver and new agricultural products arriving from overseas territories. Royal monopolies regulated distribution, centralizing profit within crown administration. Literacy among urban populations rose incrementally as printed devotional books became more accessible. Lay reading circles formed around shared texts, fostering communal engagement with scripture and moral instruction. Rural devotional practices incorporated newly canonized saints whose cults spread through printed images and pamphlets. Pilgrimage routes adjusted to accommodate emerging shrines, reflecting dynamic spirituality. Legal thought engaged more directly with questions of sovereignty. Theories of state authority articulated by jurists influenced policy, framing governance as rational structure rather than solely divine mandate. Architectural experimentation extended into domestic design. Merchant houses featured larger windows and decorative facades, signaling prosperity. Regulations balanced aesthetic ambition with structural safety. Maritime expeditions across the Atlantic culminated in voyages such as that of Christopher Columbus, whose journeys under Castilian patronage altered European awareness of geography. Royal charters defined governance of newly encountered territories, foreshadowing administrative systems beyond Europe. Clerical institutions confronted questions arising from expanded worldviews. Missionary orders prepared guidelines for conversion efforts abroad, intertwining spiritual aspiration with imperial ambition. Artisans adapted to increased demand for printed images by producing woodcuts illustrating religious scenes and maps. Workshops multiplied, regulated through privileges and oversight to ensure orthodoxy. Rural landscapes shifted as new crops, including maize, gradually entered European agriculture. Experimental cultivation required adaptation of planting schedules and storage methods. Intellectual communities corresponded across borders, sharing observations about astronomy and mathematics. Observatories recorded celestial movement with greater precision, building upon medieval foundations while edging toward new cosmologies. Throughout these transitions, continuity persisted alongside transformation. Charters, statutes, and customary rights did not dissolve overnight. Instead, they adjusted incrementally, absorbing innovation while maintaining recognizable structure. The medieval world, long defined by interlocking frameworks of belief and obligation, approached a threshold where exploration, technology, and centralized administration would redefine its contours. Yet even as horizons widened and presses multiplied pages, the imprint of centuries of regulation remained visible in law courts, guild halls, parish registers, and royal archives. Within that evolving tapestry, individuals continued to navigate expectation and opportunity, inhabiting a society poised between inheritance and change, where boundaries stretched outward yet never entirely disappeared. As the 15th century gave way to the 16th, the residue of medieval order remained embedded in habits of governance, devotion, and daily routine. Change advanced unevenly, often guided by older structures rather than sweeping them aside. What emerged was not rupture but reconfiguration, as inherited systems accommodated widening horizons. Maritime enterprise, once tentative, assumed greater scale. In ports such as Antwerp, docks expanded to receive vessels laden with sugar, dyestuffs, and precious metals. Warehouses grew taller, equipped with pulley systems that streamlined unloading. Municipal ordinances addressed crowding along quays, regulating traffic between merchants, sailors, and porters. Insurance brokers convened near harbors, drafting agreements that formalized expectation of profit and loss. Across the North Sea, fishing fleets operating from Bristol ventured into colder waters in search of cod. Preservation methods improved through salting and drying, enabling longer voyages. Royal licenses specified permitted routes and quotas, reflecting heightened interest in resource management. On continental plains, territorial consolidation intensified. Dynastic unions created composite monarchies that governed diverse populations under a single crown. Administrative councils expanded, staffed by trained jurists whose education blended Roman legal theory with local precedent. Chanceries issued decrees bearing standardized formulae, reinforcing continuity amid expansion. Rural administration grew more systematic. Parish registers began recording baptisms, marriages, and burials with increasing regularity. Such documentation provided not only spiritual record but also demographic insight. Clergy maintained these books under episcopal instruction, creating archives that linked households to institutional memory. Military transformation accelerated through professionalization. Standing forces replaced ad hoc levies in several regions. Drill manuals codified formations for infantry equipped with pikes and arquebuses. Supply chains required coordination across provinces, prompting improved road maintenance and logistical oversight. In Mediterranean waters, galleys commanded by the Ottoman fleet reshaped power balance. European states responded with naval alliances and shipbuilding initiatives. Dockyards introduced more standardized hull designs, reflecting cumulative knowledge from earlier centuries. Commerce extended eastward through caravan routes connecting to markets beyond the Black Sea. Traders negotiated passage through territories governed by varied authorities, each imposing tolls and conditions. Letters of credit and notarized contracts eased exchange across linguistic boundaries. Urban intellectual life intensified through correspondence networks sometimes described as republics of letters. Scholars in cities such as Basel exchanged treatises on theology, medicine, and natural philosophy. Printing presses there produced editions of classical texts accompanied by critical commentary, bridging medieval scholasticism and emerging humanism. Architectural patronage reflected shifting sensibilities. Town halls incorporated decorative facades adorned with civic emblems. Stone arcades framed public squares, offering sheltered space for commerce. Building regulations increasingly addressed aesthetics alongside structural safety, revealing heightened civic self-awareness. In agrarian districts, crop rotation schemes expanded to include legumes that enriched soil fertility. Manuals on husbandry circulated among literate landowners, describing techniques for drainage and livestock breeding. Though adoption varied, awareness of agricultural science widened. Across Eastern Europe, frontier settlements navigated shifting allegiances between competing empires. Fortified towns negotiated charters granting autonomy in exchange for loyalty. Cultural interchange produced hybrid artistic styles visible in church frescoes and civic decoration. Maritime cartography achieved greater precision. Maps began to depict entire continents rather than fragmented coastlines. Printing allowed broader distribution of geographic knowledge, influencing perception of global space. In rural Scandinavia, assemblies continued to convene in open fields, yet royal authority gradually centralized judicial appeal. Written law codes replaced purely oral tradition, though memory of ancestral precedent endured. Textile production in the Low Countries reached industrial scale. Looms operated in urban workshops employing numerous laborers. Regulation addressed wages and quality, attempting to balance competitiveness with social stability. Diplomacy became more continuous through resident ambassadors who observed foreign courts year-round. Reports dispatched home detailed political shifts, trade prospects, and military preparations. Such communication required reliable courier systems crossing multiple jurisdictions. Public spectacle remained integral to governance. Executions, coronations, and religious processions conveyed power visually. Yet printed broadsheets also shaped opinion, recounting events to audiences far removed from their occurrence. Theology encountered new challenges as translation of scripture into vernacular languages expanded readership. Ecclesiastical authorities debated permissible additions and annotations. Control over interpretation became central concern. In Italian city-states, banking innovations continued to influence European finance. Partnerships structured around limited liability enabled larger ventures. Accounting records grew more intricate, reflecting increased complexity of commerce. Agricultural estates experimented with tenant contracts specifying rent in cash rather than produce. Monetization altered relationships between landholder and cultivator, introducing flexibility but also vulnerability to market fluctuation. Naval conflict in the Mediterranean intensified, culminating in battles such as the engagement near Lepanto, where alliances confronted Ottoman forces. Ship design and artillery strategy revealed culmination of centuries of maritime adaptation. Urban poor relief systems developed through municipal and ecclesiastical collaboration. Hospitals expanded capacity, and alms distribution followed regulated schedules. Concern for social order accompanied charitable intent. In Iberian territories newly unified, administrative councils oversaw religious conformity with increasing vigilance. Tribunals investigated adherence to orthodoxy, reinforcing central authority over belief. Transatlantic encounters introduced unfamiliar flora and fauna into European awareness. Illustrated volumes catalogued these novelties, blending observation with inherited symbolic interpretation. Educational institutions founded during earlier centuries adapted curricula to include rhetoric and classical literature emphasized by humanist scholars. Yet theological instruction remained core component, preserving continuity with medieval foundations. Road networks improved incrementally to facilitate troop movement and trade. Bridges repaired with stone arches replaced older wooden spans, demonstrating investment in durable infrastructure. In the eastern Mediterranean, Venetian and Ottoman merchants navigated coexistence through treaties regulating trade rights. Warehouses in ports such as Istanbul stored goods from across 3 continents, reflecting convergence of commercial worlds.